a forgery, you're a fraud. But he just keeps at it. And eventually he comes up with a couple of stories about being visited by angels. Once he claimed to have been visited by an angel right as Joseph Smith was assassinated. And later he claimed that an angel led him to these plates buried under a hill. It was very much an echo of the Mormon Church's founding story. And that these plates, when he was able to translate them, and they were in a language no one else had ever seen, but he was lucky enough to be able to translate them. And of course, they claimed he was or it strongly implied he was the man. He was also lucky, Nauvoo fell right as he was emerging. Brigham Young had to flee first Iowa and then west. Strang was Brigham Young's biggest rival, and actually a serious rival in a lot of people's minds, including Brigham Young's. And a lot of people were completely scared, and for good reason, of going to the great unknown West, which, Utah was barely mapped then, and badly. John C. Fremont had done some mapping of it, but it wasn't accurate. And so a lot of people thought, maybe I'll just go to Wisconsin, which is nearby, and I'll try that utopian colony out. So Strang got lucky, too.
Right. What you mentioned, his story echoes the founding of Mormonism. And I suppose it's a smart strategy because due to telling the story to Mormons, you have already self-selected people who would be liable to believe an origin story of a prophet who receives a revelation from an angel and has hidden buried tablets. So if they believe that once, then they could likely do again. And it's also, as you said, a result of good timing. Do you think his personal charisma and abilities also are a factor that leads people to follow him?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to go back on something you just said, I think one thing we forget now is the incredible allure of Mormonism. I'm not one to comment on anyone's faith. I'm a believer myself. But one thing I can say about Joseph Smith for sure was, even if you just look at the Book of Mormon as a piece of literature, it's a stunningly interesting piece of literature, not so much from the prose, and I'm not an expert on the prose, but on the fact of it. Smith basically tells these people on the frontier, look, the Bible is ongoing and it's happening here in North America and you can be part of it. And for people who were just really battered by the economic system, by the changes in technology, by a weird social system, this is a really powerful message. And Strang, whether he believed it or not, was really able to exploit this message. In some ways, he's very much a homegrown American prophet and a homegrown American con man.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. As you said, with utopianism, in this period in the 1840s, right after the economic crash, this isn't the only utopian community. There are many in the United States. In my home state of Iowa, there were all sorts of utopian communities, partly as a reaction to this disaster, partly because the 19th century was a period where the American democratic experiment seemed to be working, and some thought, well, why not take some other old dusty ideas off the shelves that have been sitting there for centuries or millennia and see what else can work? If this old idea of Athenian democracy worked, let's try something else. So the first utopian community in Wisconsin, what does that look like? Does that look like other Mormon colonies, or does it have its own unique characteristics?
Well, according to even Strang, it pretty much looked like a slum.
Okay.
A lot of lean-to houses and whatnot. A lot of his followers were extremely poor. I think it probably looked like a dusty Midwestern frontier town, only worse.
Okay.
And it presented problems to him through his charisma, through his ability to speak. He was a really good speaker, apparently. And I can say he was a really good writer. I mean, it's a didactic kind of writing that one can find kind of not as interesting as, some of the fiction writers at the time. But man, that guy could sling words. But the colony at Voree, as he called it, the Garden of Peace, now we call it, even then it was Burlington, Wisconsin, was that some of the people who followed him up there, and some of them were leaders in the traditional wing of the church originally, quickly soured on him and saw like, "Ooh, I don't know, this guy, I'm not buying him." And they stuck around. And some of the other people who followed him left. And he realized, wow, the borders are far too open here. I can't control this. And so he yearned for a better place to run a colony like this. Like a lot of utopians, I mean, the original island of Utopia in Thomas More was an island, right? I mean, islands are utopian in that they're away from the pollutions of the world. But he also was smart enough to know, an island, that's pretty easy to defend against outsiders. And it's pretty easy to keep my enemies out, and to also keep my supporters in. It was harder to leave Beaver Island. Not impossible, of course, but much harder.
And then when he goes to Lake Michigan and this island in the north, this is probably almost completely uninhabited at this time. Is that right?
There were some Native Americans who lived. They quickly moved to another island. It was less than inhabited, but it was not particularly inhabited, I should say. But it quickly became a source of tension. So Beaver Island and the surrounding islands were there were three marginalized groups in American society that found themselves pushed up against each other and often at war with each other. One was this group of Mormons. The other were the Native Americans, and they were sort of the swing group. And the third were these local fishermen who quickly became Strang's enemies. Many of them were of Irish descent and had fled Ireland in the potato famine. And so all three of these groups were sort of on the outs in mainstream society. And so their small piece of turf becomes a much bigger thing to them than it might to other people. And so it was a really interesting sort of frontier clash that said a lot about what was going on in America at that time.
Let's look into what this colony in Michigan looks like, the pirate colony as you described. When it first begins, what does the economy look like? How soon do they get into piracy? What does the form of government look like? Is Strang the prophet/benevolent dictator? Is it a case of communism that works perfectly? How does this look?
It's a shrewd question. So in terms of what the island has to offer economically, first of all, to the islanders, are trees. And that may sound funny, but at that time, the only way to get from Detroit to Chicago, the only efficient way was by steamboat. This was before the railroads had connected to the Midwest. And so trees were fuel, and they were really important. They were also important in, eventually, all the pine trees in that part of the world were super important in settling the prairies, which didn't have any trees. So trees were actually, I think the way to think about trees then is much more like oil now. Mm-hmm. If you had them, you had some power. And Strang was very shrewd about realizing this. Among the things he ordered his people to do is to keep regrowing trees. He was an early climate scientist in a lot of different ways, and we can talk about that. But he understood that trees weren't just something you cut down. He demanded that people also grow them. Okay. As far as the form of government, the form of government switched. But it's funny you mentioned communism, because in Strang's lifetime is when the Communist Manifesto comes out. There's no evidence he read it, but he did experiment with socialism on the island, and before that in his colony in Wisconsin. And I think the interesting thing about him is, Marx and Engels said, "You have nothing to lose but your chains." But I think Strang was really early on the boat to see how this could, far from liberating people, could enslave them. So what he did is he said, boy, if you really believe in me, if you really, really believe in what I'm offering, what this faith offers, you'll turn over all your property to the group, right? Meaning me, and then I'll decide where it goes, right? By the time they were in Beaver Island, he kind of backed off that, and it sort of became just this kleptocracy, I mean, in a certain way. The one of the big inputs of cash in the colony seems to have been plundering other people. Again, the extent to which it was simply a pirate colony, we don't know, because there was a lot of anti-Mormonism, but it was a pirate colony.
Okay, so it sounds very similar to the Vikings, where they have lots of raw materials, but when you want to buffet up your economy, you go on a raid. Don't know if they captured any women in the process. I'm guessing not, but...
Yeah, I think that's not such a terrible comparison. And obviously, the Vikings had a lot on the ball as well, as did Strang and his people. And of course, he attracted to him a lot of true believers, a lot of kind of what we think of as innocents, people who really, really believed that they were preparing for the second coming. But he also drew around him a lot of other con men. And one of the really fun things about writing this book was writing about a bunch of the other colorful and corrupt characters around him.
Yeah, who joins his colony? I'm curious.
One of the most famous guys was a guy named George Adams, who was Strang's prime minister when he declared himself king. And we can talk about that. But Adams was one of the really, really amazingly colorful characters of the 19th century. He was a longtime minister who was also a Shakespearean actor, who was also a legendary drunk. And he would go around from city to city performing Shakespeare and preaching the gospel. And apparently he was very good at preaching the gospel and not so good at performing Shakespeare, but he loved doing it. And actually, theater was a kind of con, like anything else. And eventually, the great footnote on Adams is eventually he, years later, started his own colony in Palestine and lured all these people there. And it was just a disaster. It was rife with disease. He was totally inept as a prophet and as an administrator. And this colony was a famous disaster. And one of the people who happened to be on a ship with a lot of the people fleeing the colony was Mark Twain. And Twain not only wrote about Adams himself, but at least one scholar believes, and I think it's a really good argument, is that Adams was the basis for the king in Huckleberry Finn, right? If you remember, the King and the Duke were the two touring Shakespearean actors / con men of all kinds. And I think that's a great way to think about Adams. And it's not a terrible way to think about Strang. Strang and Adams were opposites. Adams was almost illiterate. His spelling is just hilarious. And Strang was incredibly bookish. Strang was shrewd and quiet most of the time and cold. Adams was drunk and loud and charismatic. And they made a great team for a very short time. And then they got into a fight. And after that, they were avowed enemies. And Adams did all sorts of damage to Strang. And in fact, he eventually helped get the island raided by the U.S. Navy.
It seems like utopian communities don't work because the Venn diagram of utopian cult leader and city manager don't really overlap. So actually leading the utopian community and forming one are two different skill sets, it seems.
Yeah, although Strang, interestingly, had a lot of skill sets and wasn't a bad administrator. And also, the other thing that's interesting about Strang is he really had this attraction to monarchy. So in his early journals, he writes about, and with earnestness, writes about this poor farm boy from Western New York, writes about Princess Victoria of England and how if he could only meet her, he knew he could marry her and that he could become king. And when Strang actually did declare himself king of the island, he had his own very formal ceremony there. His throne was stuffed with moss. The props were brought in by this guy